Ethan Miller considered himself a lucky man. At 35, he had everything he'd ever wanted: a loving wife, Allison, of 7 years, 2 beautiful children, and a best friend, Ryan Carter, who had been like a brother to him since college. Ethan's life in their quiet suburban neighborhood was picture perfect, or so he thought. It began innocently enough, as these things often do. Ethan came home one evening after a long day at work, the sun setting behind him as he parked in the driveway. From the open windows of their modest 2-story home, he could hear Allison laughing. That wasn't unusual. Allison's laughter had always been one of the things he loved most about her. But what struck Ethan as odd was that she wasn't alone. Ryan's deep voice followed her laugh, punctuated by the sound of glasses clinking. Ethan smiled. Ryan was practically family. He often stopped by unannounced. Still, something in the way they were laughing gave Ethan pause. It was too familiar, too comfortable. Shaking off the thought as paranoia, Ethan walked into the house and greeted them both warmly. "Hey, babe." "Ryan," Ethan said as he stepped into the kitchen. Allison turned, her auburn hair falling over one shoulder, and greeted him with a bright smile. Ryan stood next to her, leaning casually against the counter. "Ethan! You're home earlier than I thought," Allison said, kissing him on the cheek. Ryan smirked. "We were just catching up. I brought over a bottle of that wine you like." Ethan nodded, trying to ignore the uneasy knot forming in his stomach. It wasn't jealousy, exactly. He trusted Ryan implicitly. But as the three of them chatted over dinner, Ethan couldn't help but notice the fleeting glances between his wife and his best friend. Later that night, as he lay in bed next to Allison, Ethan found himself staring at the ceiling. Something felt off. He replayed the evening in his mind, searching for what had triggered this strange unease. Was it the way Ryan had reached for the same wine glass as Allison, only to pull back at the last second with a sheepish grin? Or the way Allison had blushed when Ryan complimented her cooking? Ethan told himself he was overthinking it. Ryan was like family, and Allison adored him like a brother. There was nothing more to it. But deep down, a tiny voice whispered that something wasn't right. The following day, Ethan decided to brush it off and focus on work. He managed a small but successful marketing agency, and the recent expansion had been keeping him busy. By the time he got home that evening, Allison was tucking their kids into bed. Ethan kissed her goodnight and settled onto the couch with his laptop to catch up on some emails. As he worked, his phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a message from Ryan. "Hey man. Thanks for letting me crash last night. Hope I wasn't intruding." Ethan frowned. Letting him crash? Ryan hadn't stayed late enough to need to crash. He'd left right after dinner, or at least, that's what Ethan thought. He typed back. "What do you mean? You left around 9, didn't you?" The 3 dots indicating Ryan was typing appeared, then disappeared, then reappeared. Finally, the response came. "Yeah, sorry, I just meant hanging out. Didn't mean to bug you guys." Something about the reply didn't sit right with Ethan. He reread it twice, but before he could think further, Allison walked into the room, wearing one of his old college sweatshirts. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice light. Ethan hesitated. "Yeah, just Ryan being Ryan." Allison smiled and kissed him on the forehead before heading to bed. Ethan watched her go, his unease growing stronger. The next morning, Ethan's curiosity got the better of him. After dropping the kids off at school, he stopped by Ryan's apartment unannounced. He told himself it was just a casual visit, but when Ryan opened the door, he looked startled. "Ethan." "Hey, what's up?" Ryan said, his voice tinged with surprise. "Just thought I'd swing by. Got a few hours before my first meeting," Ethan replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Ryan's apartment was messy, as usual, but something felt different. Ethan's gaze landed on a half-empty bottle of wine sitting on the counter. The same brand Ryan had brought to their house 2 nights before. "Had a party I didn't know about?" Ethan asked, keeping his tone light. Ryan shrugged, but his body language was stiff. Nah, just had some friends over the other night. You know how it is. Ethan nodded, though a sinking feeling settled in his chest. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he felt like he was missing something important. As he left Ryan's apartment, Ethan resolved to push the thought aside. He was being paranoid, wasn't he? But as the days passed, the uneasy feeling only grew stronger. And Ethan had no idea that pulling at this first thread would soon unravel everything he thought he knew about his perfect life. Ethan tried to ignore the growing unease, but it lingered like an itch he couldn't scratch. The days slipped by, but his mind kept replaying Ryan's odd message and the way Allison had acted that evening. It wasn't just her blushing or the way she laughed at Ryan's jokes. There was a subtle shift in her behavior, something he couldn't quite define but couldn't let go of either. The first real crack appeared on a Thursday night. Ethan had planned a surprise date for Allison, something to shake up their routine and rekindle the spark that sometimes felt dimmed by the monotony of daily life. He'd arranged for their favorite babysitter to watch the kids and made reservations at a cozy Italian restaurant downtown where they'd shared countless memories in their early years. But when he mentioned the idea to Allison that morning, she hesitated. "Oh, tonight? I thought you'd be working late," she said, her voice laced with surprise. Ethan frowned. "I wrapped things up early. Figured we could use some time, just the two of us." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's so sweet, Ethan, but I already promised Sarah I'd help her with some wedding planning tonight." Sarah, Ethan thought, Allison's childhood best friend. He'd always liked Sarah, warm, bubbly, and fiercely loyal. But Sarah was also disorganized to a fault. It wasn't unusual for her to ask for Allison's help with last-minute tasks. Still, something about Allison's explanation didn't sit right. He nodded anyway, masking his disappointment. "Sure. Rain check then?" "Absolutely," she said, leaning in to kiss him on the cheek. But as she pulled away, Ethan caught a flicker of something in her expression. Guilt? Worry? He couldn't tell. That evening, after putting the kids to bed, Ethan found himself restless. Allison had left an hour earlier, dressed a little nicer than he'd expected for a casual night of wedding planning. She'd kissed him goodbye, her smile lingering for just a moment too long, as if to reassure him. Ethan tried to distract himself with work, but his concentration wavered. After an hour of staring blankly at spreadsheets, he decided to call it a night. As he reached for his phone to check the time, he noticed a notification he hadn't seen earlier, a shared location update from Allison. They'd set up location sharing years ago, mostly for emergencies or convenience. He'd rarely thought about it since, but now his thumb hovered over the icon. He hesitated, telling himself it was irrational to check. Yet, his finger moved almost on its own, tapping the screen. The map loaded slowly, but when it did, Ethan felt his heart drop. Allison wasn't at Sarah's house. She was across town, near a park on the edge of the city. Ethan stared at the screen, his mind racing. Maybe Sarah had dragged her to some late-night errand, or maybe they'd decided to meet a vendor. He told himself there had to be an explanation, but his instincts screamed otherwise. Without giving himself time to reconsider, Ethan grabbed his keys and jacket. His hands trembled slightly as he started the car. The drive felt endless, even though it only took 20 minutes. He parked a block away from the location and sat in the car, his pulse pounding in his ears. The park was quiet, bathed in the glow of streetlights and the faint shimmer of moonlight. Ethan scanned the area, searching for any sign of Allison. At first, there was nothing but the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves. Then he saw them. Allison's auburn hair was unmistakable, even in the dim light. She stood near a bench, her arms crossed as if she were nervous. Opposite her was a man, his back to Ethan. It didn't take long to recognize him. Ryan. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His first instinct was to march over, demand answers, but something held him back. He slid lower in his seat, watching, his stomach churning. Ryan said something, and Allison nodded, her body language tense. Then, to Ethan's horror, Ryan reached out and took her hand. Allison didn't pull away. Ethan gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but the body language spoke volumes. Allison glanced around nervously before stepping closer to Ryan. The two of them stood just inches apart, their faces illuminated by a nearby lamp. And then it happened. Ryan leaned in, and Allison didn't resist. Their kiss was brief but intimate, and it shattered something deep inside Ethan. He couldn't watch anymore. His hands shook as he started the car, his mind a whirlwind of emotions: rage, betrayal, confusion. He drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, trying to process what he'd just seen. When he finally returned home, Allison was already there, curled up on the couch with her laptop. She looked up and smiled, as if nothing had happened. "How was Sarah's?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "Oh, it was fine," she replied casually. "We went over some floral arrangements. Nothing too exciting." Ethan stared at her, searching for cracks in her facade, but her expression remained calm, almost too calm. That night, as Allison slept beside him, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The woman he loved, the mother of his children, had just lied to his face. And his best friend, the man he trusted more than anyone, was the reason why. But Ethan wasn't a man to act on impulse. He'd always prided himself on being methodical, measured. If there was one thing he knew, it was this: he couldn't confront them, not yet. He needed proof, something undeniable. As the first rays of dawn crept through the blinds, Ethan made a decision. He would uncover the truth, no matter how deep the betrayal ran. And when he did, they would both regret underestimating him. Ethan wasn't the kind of man to act on suspicion alone. He needed facts, concrete evidence to back up what he'd seen. Though the image of Allison and Ryan kissing in the park was seared into his mind, it wasn't enough. His emotions surged like a tidal wave, but he forced himself to stay calm, to think logically. If he was going to confront them, it had to be on his terms. The following morning, Ethan woke up before Allison and slipped into his office. The room, filled with bookshelves and old family photos, had always been his sanctuary. Now, it would serve as his war room. He opened his laptop and began researching ways to track messages and calls discreetly. The thought of spying on Allison felt wrong, invasive, but he rationalized it: they had already broken the trust. He wasn't the one who had destroyed their marriage, he was simply uncovering the truth. After an hour of searching, Ethan downloaded a program that would allow him to monitor activity on Allison's phone. It required physical access to the device, so he waited for the perfect opportunity. That opportunity came later that afternoon when Allison went upstairs to take a shower. She left her phone on the kitchen counter, as she always did, completely unaware that Ethan was watching. His heart pounded as he picked it up, quickly connecting it to his laptop. The seconds stretched like hours as he installed the software, every sound in the house amplified by his racing nerves. When the program confirmed the installation was complete, Ethan set her phone back in its exact spot and retreated to his office. From that point on, every text, call, and social media message Allison received would be logged on Ethan's laptop. At first, there was nothing unusual. Allison's chats with Sarah were exactly as she described: innocuous conversations about wedding plans and floral arrangements. Her texts with Ethan were sweet and affectionate, even if they felt hollow to him now. Then, a message from an unsaved number appeared. "Tonight. Usual place?" Ethan's stomach sank. He immediately opened the conversation, scrolling up to read the previous messages. The texts were sparse, as if they were deliberately avoiding leaving a trail. But the tone was unmistakable, intimate, secretive. The unsaved number belonged to Ryan. Ethan clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he stared at the screen. He felt the urge to storm out of the house, to confront Ryan and Allison immediately. But he stopped himself. The messages weren't explicit enough to be definitive proof, and Ethan knew that without undeniable evidence, they could spin it as innocent. That evening, Ethan acted as though nothing was wrong. He played with the kids, joked with Allison, and even helped her clean up after dinner. Inside, though, he was a storm barely contained. When Allison mentioned she was heading out to Sarah's again, Ethan nodded calmly. "Tell her I said hi," he said, smiling as he kissed her goodbye. As soon as the door closed behind her, Ethan sprang into action. He opened the tracking app on his phone and watched as Allison's location appeared on the map. She wasn't heading toward Sarah's. Instead, she was driving toward the same park where Ethan had seen her with Ryan. Grabbing his jacket, Ethan followed her, staying far enough behind that she wouldn't notice. His heart raced as he parked a block away and crept toward the park on foot. Sure enough, there they were. Ryan and Allison sat on the same bench as before, their heads close together, as they spoke in hushed tones. Allison's expression was serious, her brow furrowed, while Ryan seemed agitated, gesturing with his hands as he spoke. Ethan couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told him enough. When Ryan reached out to touch Allison's cheek, Ethan felt his blood boil. He clenched his fists, every fiber of his being urging him to confront them, but he forced himself to stay hidden. This wasn't the time. Not yet. The next day, Ethan took his investigation further. He hired a private investigator, a decision he'd never imagined himself making. The PI, a sharp-eyed woman named Jessica, assured him she'd get to the bottom of it. Over the next week, Jessica followed Allison and Ryan, documenting their every move. Ethan's suspicions were confirmed when she handed him a folder filled with photographs. Allison and Ryan meeting at the park, sharing intimate moments, and even leaving a motel together. The evidence was undeniable. Ethan stared at the photos, his chest tight with anger and betrayal. But alongside the rage, there was something else, a cold, calculated determination. If they thought they could humiliate him and walk away unscathed, they were sorely mistaken. He began planning his next move. Ethan wasn't just going to confront them. He was going to make sure they felt the full weight of their betrayal. The first step was subtle. He began pulling away from Allison emotionally, creating a distance that she couldn't quite put her finger on. He stopped initiating affection, answered her questions with vague responses, and spent more time locked in his office. Allison noticed the change, of course. "Is everything okay?" she asked one night as they lay in bed. Ethan turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Just work stress," he said, brushing off her concern. But inside, Ethan was anything but stressed. He was focused, methodical, and determined to set his plan in motion. He knew Allison and Ryan believed they were clever, that they'd covered their tracks well enough to avoid suspicion. They had no idea that Ethan was always one step ahead. Ethan's plan was coming together, and the more he observed Allison and Ryan, the more meticulous he became. He moved through his days like an actor in a play, ensuring every line and action was perfectly rehearsed. On the surface, he was the same loving husband and reliable friend. Underneath, though, he was methodically laying the groundwork for his revenge. The private investigator's photos had given him more than enough proof of the affair. He'd studied each one with a cold, clinical eye, memorizing the details. The way Allison smiled at Ryan, the way Ryan looked at her, the small gestures that spoke volumes about their relationship. What stung the most was how ordinary it all seemed, as if they had grown comfortable in their betrayal. Ethan wasn't angry anymore. Anger was too volatile, too reckless. Instead, he felt a quiet, calculated resolve. They had betrayed him, and he would make them pay. The first step was to gather more leverage. While the photographs and text messages were damning, Ethan wanted to ensure there was no way for Allison or Ryan to deny their actions. He installed hidden cameras in the house, focusing on areas where they might meet if Ryan dared to visit while Ethan was at work. Sure enough, his efforts paid off. 2 days later, while he was working late at the office, a lie he deliberately fed to Allison, Ethan watched the live feed on his laptop as Ryan arrived at the house. Allison let him in, her face lighting up in a way Ethan hadn't seen in months. They moved to the living room, where they sat close on the couch. Their conversation was low and intimate, punctuated by touches and stolen kisses. Ethan watched silently, his expression blank, as they laughed together like teenagers sneaking around. But Ethan wasn't watching to torture himself. He was collecting evidence, and every second of their interaction was being recorded. That night, when Ethan returned home, Allison greeted him warmly, as if nothing had happened. She kissed him on the cheek, asking about his day, while he struggled not to recoil from her touch. "It was fine," he replied, his voice neutral. "Long but fine." She smiled, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. The next few weeks passed in a similar fashion. Ethan continued to gather evidence, cataloging every text, every meeting, every moment of deceit. At the same time, he began putting his larger plan into action. First, he started subtly distancing himself from Ryan. The two men had been inseparable for years, but now Ethan limited their interactions, claiming work and family obligations as excuses. Ryan seemed to notice but didn't push. Perhaps he thought it was a stroke of luck, that Ethan's busyness gave him and Allison more freedom to carry on their affair. Next, Ethan began preparing for the financial fallout. He consulted a lawyer in secret, carefully documenting the evidence of Allison's infidelity to ensure he would have the upper hand in any potential divorce proceedings. The lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Linda, was impressed by Ethan's thoroughness. "With this kind of evidence, you'll have a strong case," she said, flipping through the folder of photos and text messages. "If you play your cards right, you could walk away with custody and a significant share of the assets." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. "I'm not just going to play my cards right," he said. "I'm going to make sure they regret ever playing this game." Linda raised an eyebrow but didn't comment further. Ethan's final preparation was the most difficult. He began quietly reaching out to friends and family, subtly planting seeds of doubt about Ryan. He didn't accuse him outright. He wanted to keep the facade intact until the perfect moment, but he made casual comments about Ryan's odd behavior and changes in personality. "I don't know," Ethan said one evening to his sister Claire over the phone. "He's just been distant lately. It's not like him." Claire, who had always been protective of Ethan, immediately jumped to his defense. "If Ryan's being weird, there's probably a reason. You should keep an eye on him." Ethan smiled grimly. "Oh, I plan to." With the groundwork laid, Ethan began planning the final act. He knew he couldn't simply confront them in private. It would be too easy for them to twist the narrative, to downplay their betrayal. No, he needed an audience. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. Allison's birthday was approaching, and she suggested a small gathering at their house with close friends and family. It was the perfect setting, a group of people who knew and loved both Ethan and Allison, who would see the truth firsthand. Ethan played along, feigning enthusiasm as he helped Allison plan the party. He even suggested inviting Ryan, knowing full well that she would want him there. The night of the party, Ethan felt a calmness wash over him. He'd rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times, and he was ready. Allison was radiant in a deep green dress, laughing and chatting with their guests as if nothing were amiss. Ryan arrived halfway through the evening, greeting Ethan with his usual charm. "Hey man! Long time no see." Ethan forced a smile. "Good to see you, Ryan. Glad you could make it." Inside, Ethan felt nothing but contempt, but he kept his mask firmly in place. The night unfolded like any other celebration, with drinks, laughter, and light-hearted toasts. But as the evening wore on, Ethan knew it was time to strike. Standing in the middle of the living room, surrounded by their closest friends and family, Ethan raised his glass. "Can I have everyone's attention for a moment?" The room quieted, all eyes on him. Allison stood beside him, smiling warmly, oblivious to what was about to happen. "I just wanted to say how grateful I am for all of you being here tonight," Ethan began, his voice steady. "Allison, you've been my rock, my partner, and the love of my life. I wanted to take this moment to thank you for everything you've done for me and our family." Allison blushed, her smile growing wider. "But," Ethan continued, his tone sharpening, "I think it's only fair to share with everyone just how much effort you've been putting into other aspects of your life." A ripple of confusion spread through the room. Allison's smile faltered, and Ryan stiffened, his drink frozen halfway to his lips. Ethan turned toward the TV on the wall, where he had prepared a slideshow. With the press of a button on his phone, the screen lit up, and the first image appeared, a photo of Allison and Ryan kissing at the park. Gasps filled the room. Allison's face went pale. "Ethan, what is this?" she stammered. Ethan looked at her coldly. "This, Allison, is the truth." The room fell into stunned silence. The image on the TV lingered like an uninvited ghost, refusing to be ignored. Allison's face drained of color as her hands flew to her mouth, and Ryan's expression shifted from confusion to sheer panic. Ethan stood in the center of it all, calm and collected, holding his drink like a man toasting at a wedding, not detonating his own marriage. "Ethan," Allison choked out, her voice trembling. "What is this? Where did you—" Ethan raised a hand, cutting her off. "Oh, don't play dumb, Allison. You and Ryan have been meeting up for weeks, months, probably. I have the photos, the texts, the proof. And now, so does everyone else." The weight of his words settled over the room like a suffocating fog. Friends and family exchanged uncomfortable glances, whispers buzzing like static. "Wait a second, Ethan," Ryan stammered, stepping forward, his hands raised defensively. "This isn't what it looks like." Ethan's laugh was cold and humorless. "Not what it looks like? Really? Because to me, it looks exactly like what it is. My wife and my so-called best friend sneaking around behind my back." "Ethan, please," Allison pleaded, her voice cracking. "Can we just talk about this privately?" Ethan's gaze turned icy. "Oh, now you want privacy? That's funny because you didn't seem too concerned about privacy when you were meeting Ryan at the park. Or when you were sneaking off to that motel." The mention of the motel sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd. Claire, Ethan's sister, stepped forward, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "Allison, is this true?" Allison's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Tears welled in her eyes, and she turned to Ryan as if seeking an escape, but Ryan looked just as cornered. "Ethan," Ryan began, his voice shaky. "Let's not do this here, man. We've been friends for years. We can work this out." Ethan's expression darkened. "Work this out? Ryan, you've been sleeping with my wife. There's no working this out. You betrayed me, and you betrayed everyone in this room who trusted you." Ethan took a step closer, his voice lowering but gaining an edge that sent chills through the room. "You know, I always thought of you as family. But you're nothing more than a snake." Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but Ethan didn't give him the chance. He turned back to the TV, clicking through more photos. Each one was worse than the last. Images of Allison and Ryan holding hands, kissing, entering the motel together. By the time he reached the final slide, the evidence was overwhelming. Allison crumpled into a chair, her head in her hands. The tears were flowing freely now, but Ethan felt no sympathy. "Ethan," she sobbed. I don't know what to say. I made a mistake. I love you. It didn't mean anything, I swear." Ethan's jaw tightened. "It didn't mean anything? Is that supposed to make this better? Because let me tell you something, Allison, it meant everything to me. You meant everything to me. And you threw it all away." The room was silent except for Allison's quiet sobs. Ryan stood frozen, his face pale, unable to meet Ethan's eyes. "Here's the thing, though," Ethan continued, his voice steady. "I didn't just find out about this last week. I've known for months. I've been watching, waiting, giving you every chance to come clean. But you didn't. And now, you get to deal with the consequences." Allison looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with desperation. "Ethan, please. I'll do anything to fix this. Just tell me what to do." Ethan's laugh was bitter. "Fix this? There's no fixing this, Allison. But don't worry, I've already taken care of everything." Allison frowned, confusion flickering across her face. "What do you mean?" Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. "This he said, tossing it onto the coffee table, is a copy of the divorce papers. And before you even think about fighting me on this, let me remind you that I have everything I need to make sure you don't get a dime more than you deserve. Allison's eyes widened, and Ryan's face twisted in disbelief. Divorce? Ethan, you don't have to do this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Oh, I do, Ethan replied coldly. But don't worry, you'll still have Ryan to keep you company. That is, assuming he's still willing to play house once this is all over. Ryan finally spoke, his voice trembling with anger. Ethan, you're being cruel. You don't have to humiliate her like this. Ethan turned to him, his expression like steel. You want to talk about cruelty, Ryan? Let's talk about how you came into my house, sat at my table, played with my kids, all while sleeping with my wife behind my back. Don't you dare lecture me about cruelty. Ryan's mouth snapped shut, and he looked away, his shoulders slumping. Ethan turned to the room, addressing the stunned crowd. I'm sorry you all had to see this, but I'm done pretending everything is fine. I deserve better than this, and I refuse to let them get away with what they've done. With that, he grabbed his coat and walked out the door, leaving Allison and Ryan to face the wreckage they'd created. Outside, the crisp night air hit Ethan like a slap, but he felt strangely light, as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. The betrayal still burned, but so did a new sense of clarity. This wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning. Ethan didn't go home that night. He drove aimlessly through the quiet streets, the weight of what had just unfolded pressing down on him. The exhilaration of finally exposing Allison and Ryan had faded, leaving a strange emptiness in its place. He had planned for this moment meticulously, but now that it was over, the reality of what lay ahead began to sink in. Around midnight, Ethan found himself parked outside a 24-hour diner. The neon sign buzzed softly in the stillness, casting a red glow over the empty parking lot. He went inside, ordered a coffee he didn't really want, and stared out the window. His phone buzzed on the table. It had been going off nonstop since he left the party. He didn't need to check to know who it was, Allison. The endless string of calls and texts was just another layer of noise in his already crowded mind. He let them go unanswered. Eventually, he scrolled through his messages, not to respond but to read the desperate pleas Allison had sent. Ethan, please come home. We need to talk. I'm so sorry. I'll do anything to make this right. You don't understand. It was a mistake. Please don't give up on us. A bitter laugh escaped Ethan's lips. A mistake. That word again. As if she tripped and fallen into Ryan's arms by accident. He deleted the messages without replying and turned his phone face down on the table. By the time Ethan returned home the next morning, the house was silent. Allison was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and blotchy from crying. She looked up when he walked in, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and fear. You came back, she said softly, her voice barely audible. I live here, Ethan replied flatly, setting his keys on the counter. Allison stood, wringing her hands nervously. Ethan, can we please talk? Just for a minute. I need to explain. You've already explained enough. Ethan interrupted, his voice cold. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. What could you possibly say to me now that I haven't already figured out? Allison hesitated, tears brimming in her eyes. I wasn't thinking clearly. It was a mistake, Ethan. I love you. I've always loved you. Ethan stared at her unmoved. You have a funny way of showing it. Her shoulders slumped, and she took a tentative step closer. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging you. For the kids, for our family, we can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can. Ethan's laugh was sharp and humorless. Counseling? You think counseling is going to undo what you did? Do you even hear yourself? Allison flinched at the harshness of his tone, but Ethan didn't stop. The anger he'd kept bottled up for months spilled out like a dam breaking. You lied to me, Allison. Over and over again. You betrayed me, humiliated me, and you expect me to just, what? Pretend it never happened? Go back to the way things were? I'm sorry, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I was weak. I didn't mean to hurt you. But you did, Ethan said, his voice quieter now but no less firm. You made a choice, Allison. And now you have to live with it. She collapsed into the chair, sobbing, but Ethan felt no pity. He turned and walked upstairs, leaving her alone in the kitchen. The next few days were a blur of tense silences and awkward avoidance. Ethan threw himself into work, staying at the office late and avoiding Allison as much as possible. Meanwhile, she tried desperately to mend what couldn't be fixed. She cleaned the house obsessively, cooked his favorite meals, and left notes on his desk saying how much she loved him. Ethan ignored them all. Ryan, on the other hand, had gone radio silent. Ethan hadn't heard a word from him since the night of the party. Mutual friends, sensing the tension, began reaching out to Ethan, asking what had happened. He kept his explanations brief and vague, unwilling to air all the dirty laundry just yet. But the silence from Ryan didn't last long. One afternoon, Ethan was at work when his phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. Ethan, it's me. Ryan's voice came through the line, hesitant and strained. Ethan clenched his jaw, gripping the phone tighter. What do you want? I wanted to apologize, Ryan said. I messed up, man. I don't even know what to say. I never meant for this to happen. Ethan's laugh was bitter. Never meant for it to happen? That's rich. You didn't just trip and fall into my wife's bed, Ryan. You knew exactly what you were doing. I know, Ryan admitted. I screwed up, and I hate myself for it. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I had to tell you I'm sorry. Ethan was silent for a long moment, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. You think sorry is enough? You think you can call me up, apologize, and we'll just move on? You destroyed everything, Ryan. You destroyed my marriage, my trust, my family. Do you even understand what you've done? Ryan's voice cracked. I swear, Ethan, it didn't mean anything. It was stupid, and I was stupid. I wish I could take it back. But you can't, Ethan snapped. And now you have to live with the consequences. He hung up without waiting for a reply, his hands trembling with rage. As Ethan sat there, staring at the phone, a new sense of clarity washed over him. The time for anger was over. It was time to take control of his life, to rebuild what had been broken, not for Allison, not for Ryan, but for himself and his children. Ethan wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain: he was done being a victim. The days that followed Ryan's call marked a turning point for Ethan. He realized that the rage he had been carrying, the sense of betrayal that had consumed him, could not be allowed to define him forever. Anger had fueled his actions so far, but now it was time to focus on rebuilding his life, for himself, for his children, and for the future he deserved. The first step was practical: moving forward with the divorce. Ethan wasted no time finalizing the details with his lawyer, Linda, who praised his meticulous preparation. Once this is filed, Allison doesn't have much room to negotiate, Linda told him during their next meeting. The evidence is overwhelming. You're in a strong position to retain custody and protect your assets. That's all I want, Ethan said firmly. My kids deserve stability, and I'll do whatever it takes to give it to them. Linda nodded, her expression one of quiet respect. You're handling this better than most people would in your situation. I've seen plenty of messy divorces, and trust me, you're ahead of the game. Ethan wasn't sure if he felt ahead of anything, but her words gave him a small sense of validation. The second step was emotional. Ethan began seeing a therapist, a decision he never thought he'd make but one that quickly proved invaluable. His therapist, Dr. Klein, was a calm, measured presence who guided him through the tangled mess of his emotions. You've been through a profound betrayal, Dr. Klein said during one session. It's natural to feel anger, sadness, and even self-doubt. But what's important is that you don't let those feelings control you. You're already taking steps to regain control of your life, and that's something to be proud of. Ethan nodded, though the concept of pride still felt foreign to him. I just don't want to feel like this anymore, he admitted. Like I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next blow to land. That's understandable, Dr. Klein said. But trust takes time to rebuild, not just in others, but in yourself. Right now, your focus should be on what you can control, your actions, your choices, and your future. Those words stayed with Ethan. He began channeling his energy into positive outlets, spending more time with his kids, reconnecting with old friends, and throwing himself into his work. Slowly, he started to feel like himself again, though the scars of Allison and Ryan's betrayal remained. But Ethan wasn't the only one trying to move forward. Allison, desperate to salvage what was left of their family, continued her attempts to reconcile. She left handwritten notes on Ethan's nightstand, sent him long emails pouring her heart out, and even tried to enlist mutual friends to mediate on her behalf. I made a mistake, one of her emails read. But mistakes don't have to define us, Ethan. We can rebuild this together. Please give me a chance to prove to you that I can be better. That we can be better. Ethan didn't respond. Meanwhile, Ryan had gone radio silent again, which was just fine with Ethan. The damage had been done, and there was nothing Ryan could say that would change the way Ethan felt. Their friendship, if it could even be called that anymore, was over. One evening, as Ethan was tucking his kids into bed, his daughter, Lily, asked him a question that caught him off guard. Daddy, are you and Mommy mad at each other? Ethan froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. Lily was only 6, far too young to fully understand what was happening. But she was perceptive, and Ethan knew he couldn't lie to her. Mommy and I are going through a hard time right now, he said carefully. But no matter what happens, we both love you and your brother very much. That will never change. Lily seemed to accept the answer, but her wide eyes lingered on his face, searching for reassurance. Ethan kissed her forehead and tucked her in, his heart aching at the thought of how this would affect his children. The next morning, Allison approached him in the kitchen, her expression tentative. Ethan, can we talk? She asked. Ethan set down his coffee, bracing himself. What is it? She took a deep breath. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I know I've hurt you in ways I can never undo. But I need to know, is there any chance for us? For our family? Ethan stared at her, his emotions swirling. He saw the vulnerability in her eyes, the genuine regret etched into her face. But he also saw the years of lies, the betrayal, and the pain she had caused. Allison, he said quietly, I've spent weeks trying to figure out if I could ever forgive you. If I could ever trust you again. And the truth is, I don't think I can. Her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. But Ethan, No, he said, cutting her off. You don't get to explain anymore. I gave you everything, Allison. I trusted you completely. And you threw it away for what? For Ryan? Was it worth it? She shook her head, sobbing. It wasn't worth it. It was the worst mistake of my life. Please, Ethan, I'll do anything to fix this. Ethan's voice hardened. The only thing you can do now is accept that this is over. I've already filed for divorce, and I'm not changing my mind. The kids and I will be fine. But you're going to have to figure out how to live with what you've done. Allison broke down completely, sinking into a chair as her sobs filled the room. Ethan turned away, unable to watch her fall apart. He knew he'd done the right thing, but that didn't make it any easier. As he walked out of the kitchen, Ethan felt a strange sense of closure. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was finally moving forward. In the weeks following Ethan's decision to move forward with the divorce, life at home settled into an uneasy rhythm. Allison stayed in the house for the sake of the kids, but the emotional distance between them was palpable. Conversations were brief and perfunctory, limited to logistics about the children or household matters. Ethan kept his guard up, refusing to engage in any of Allison's attempts to rekindle something that no longer existed. Outside the house, word of the betrayal had started to spread. Ethan had been careful not to broadcast the details to everyone, but the fallout from the party was impossible to contain. Friends and neighbors, some of whom had been at the gathering, began to whisper. Ryan had retreated into the shadows, avoiding anyone who might ask questions. Ethan found himself navigating a strange mixture of pity and awkwardness whenever he interacted with acquaintances. At the grocery store, a neighbor hesitated before asking, "Hey, how are you holding up?" At work, a colleague avoided eye contact when Ethan mentioned the divorce in passing. Everyone seemed to know, but no one wanted to dig too deep, afraid of uncovering something messy. Ethan didn't care. He didn't have the energy to manage other people's discomfort. One rainy Saturday morning, as Ethan sat at the dining table going over some work documents, there was a knock at the door. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the kids were upstairs playing. He opened the door to find Sarah, Allison's best friend, standing on the porch. "Sarah?" Ethan said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" Sarah was visibly nervous, twisting her hands as she shifted from foot to foot. "Can I come in? I need to talk to you." Ethan hesitated but stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. She walked in, shaking raindrops from her umbrella, and glanced around the house. "Where's Allison?" she asked. "She's out running errands," Ethan replied, crossing his arms. "What's this about?" Sarah looked conflicted, as if she were debating whether to speak at all. Finally, she sighed and sat down at the kitchen table. "Ethan, I've been wrestling with this for weeks. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, but you need to know the whole truth." Ethan stiffened. "The whole truth? What do you mean?" Sarah hesitated, then looked him straight in the eye. "I knew about the affair. I didn't want to, but Allison told me months ago. She begged me not to say anything." Ethan's jaw tightened, his pulse quickening. "You knew? And you didn't tell me?" "I wanted to," Sarah said quickly, her voice trembling. "But Allison swore she would end it. She said it was a one-time mistake, that she was going to fix things with you. I believed her, Ethan. I really thought she was going to do the right thing." Ethan's stomach churned. The betrayal felt fresh all over again, not just from Allison but from Sarah, someone he had trusted to be honest. "I can't believe this," he said, his voice low and tense. "You were supposed to be her best friend. You knew what she was doing, and you let her keep lying to me." "I didn't let her do anything," Sarah said, her tone defensive now. "Do you think I wanted to keep her secret? I told her she was making a huge mistake. I told her she would lose everything if she didn't come clean. But she didn't listen, Ethan. And when I saw what happened at the party, I realized how far it had gone. That's why I'm here. I can't keep this to myself anymore." Ethan stared at her, trying to process her words. "Why now? Why tell me this now, when it's too late to change anything?" Sarah's face softened, and she looked genuinely regretful. "Because you deserve to know the kind of person Allison has become. You deserve the truth, all of it. There's something else, Ethan." His stomach dropped. "What else?" Sarah took a deep breath, as if bracing herself. "The affair didn't start a few months ago. It's been going on for over a year." The room seemed to tilt around Ethan. "A year?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I didn't know at first. She hid it from everyone, even me. But eventually she slipped up and told me. She said she didn't mean for it to happen, that it just spiraled. I didn't want to believe it, but the more I saw, the more obvious it became. She wasn't going to stop, Ethan. Not unless she was forced to." Ethan sank into a chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He felt like he couldn't breathe. A year. The betrayal ran deeper than he'd imagined. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked again, his voice hoarse. "Because you need to know what you're dealing with," Sarah said. "And because I feel guilty. I should have told you sooner, but I didn't, and for that I'm sorry." Ethan didn't respond. His mind was spinning, replaying every moment from the past year through a new lens. The late nights Allison had claimed she was working, The sudden mood swings, the unexplained absences, it all made sense now. "I don't know what you want me to do with this information," he said finally. "I don't want anything from you," Sarah said. "I just thought you deserved to know the full story." Ethan nodded slowly, though he wasn't sure he could handle knowing more. "Thanks for telling me, I guess. But if you're looking for forgiveness, don't hold your breath." Sarah flinched but nodded. "I understand." She stood, gathering her umbrella. "For what it's worth, Ethan, I hope you find a way to move on from this. You deserve better." As she left, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring into the distance. The weight of the new revelations pressed down on him, but amidst the pain, a strange clarity emerged. This wasn't just about Allison and Ryan anymore. It was about Ethan reclaiming his life, his dignity, and his future. He had been betrayed, yes, but he wouldn't let that define him. He wouldn't just survive this. He would rise above it. The new revelations from Sarah had shaken Ethan to his core. For days he wrestled with the thought that the betrayal had been going on far longer than he'd imagined. A full year. A year of lies, a year of smiling at him while stabbing him in the back. It was a wound that seemed to deepen the more he thought about it. But Ethan wasn't one to wallow. If anything, the news strengthened his resolve. He had already exposed their affair, taken steps to secure his divorce, and begun rebuilding his life. Now, armed with the full truth, he decided it was time to finish what he started, his quiet revenge. Ethan began by reaching out to key people in their shared social circles, friends, colleagues, and even a few acquaintances who had always been closer to Ryan than to him. He didn't do it directly. Instead, he let subtle comments slip during conversations. "It's been a tough few months," he'd say with a sigh when someone asked how he was doing. Finding out about Allison and Ryan's betrayal was a real punch to the gut. The reactions were predictable: shocked gasps, awkward silences, and occasionally, quiet murmurs of sympathy. Ethan didn't dwell on the topic or offer unnecessary details. He let their imaginations fill in the blanks. People loved to connect the dots on their own, and Ethan knew that once the rumor mill started turning, it would be unstoppable. Ryan, who had been laying low since the party, began feeling the consequences almost immediately. Invitations to social events dried up. Friends stopped returning his calls. The few who did talk to him sounded hesitant, as if they didn't know how to navigate the situation. Allison wasn't spared either. Though she still lived in the house, her world had shrunk considerably. Friends she had once confided in now kept her at arm's length, unsure how to approach her after Ethan's revelations. She still tried to mend things with Ethan, but every attempt was met with cold indifference. By the time the divorce proceedings began, Ethan was fully prepared. His lawyer, Linda, had crafted an airtight case, bolstered by the overwhelming evidence of Allison's infidelity. Ethan wasn't interested in vindictiveness. He didn't want to destroy Allison financially or take more than his fair share. All he wanted was what was fair, and for the kids to stay with him. The negotiations were tense, with Allison's lawyer trying to push back on certain terms, but the evidence left little room for argument. "I'm not looking to drag this out," Ethan said during one of the mediation sessions. "But I'm not compromising on custody or on the house. Those are non-negotiable." Allison, who sat across the table looking pale and drained, nodded silently. She didn't argue. She knew she had no leverage. In the end, Ethan walked away with full custody of the kids, the house, and a settlement that left Allison with enough to move forward but not enough to make her life comfortable. It wasn't revenge, it was justice. Despite his efforts to keep things clean, Ethan knew the day would come when Ryan would try to confront him. That day arrived unexpectedly on a Saturday afternoon. Ethan was outside mowing the lawn when Ryan's car pulled up to the curb. Ethan turned off the mower and wiped his hands on his jeans, watching as Ryan got out of the car. He looked disheveled, his once confident demeanor replaced by something more subdued. "Ethan," Ryan said, his voice uncertain. "Can we talk?" Ethan crossed his arms, leaning against the mower. "What's there to talk about?" Ryan hesitated, glancing around as if searching for the right words. I wanted to apologize. Again. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to make things right. Ethan's expression remained unreadable. Make things right? How exactly do you plan to do that, Ryan? You can't undo what you did. You can't give me back the years I wasted trusting you, or her. Ryan flinched but pressed on. I know I messed up. I ruined everything. But I don't want to lose you, man. You're like a brother to me. Ethan laughed bitterly. A brother? That's rich, coming from you. You don't betray your brother, Ryan. You don't sleep with his wife behind his back for over a year and then act like you're the victim. Ryan's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, Ethan thought he might leave. But then Ryan straightened, his tone growing more desperate. I made a mistake, Ethan. A terrible mistake. But you've got to believe me, it didn't mean anything. It wasn't about hurting you. Ethan's eyes narrowed, his voice like ice. Didn't mean anything? It meant enough for you to risk everything. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise. Ryan took a step closer, but Ethan held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. Do yourself a favor, Ryan, Ethan said quietly. Walk away. You've done enough damage. There's no fixing this. Ryan hesitated, then nodded slowly, his face crumpling with defeat. He got back in his car and drove away, leaving Ethan standing alone in the yard. With the divorce finalized and Ryan out of his life, Ethan finally began to feel a sense of closure. He focused on his kids, who had adjusted surprisingly well to the new routine. He took them to the park, helped them with their homework, and made sure they knew how much he loved them. For the first time in months, Ethan felt a flicker of hope for the future. He wasn't the same man he'd been before the betrayal, but maybe that was a good thing. He was stronger now, more resilient. And he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he could face them. As he sat on the back porch one evening, watching the sun set over the horizon, Ethan allowed himself a small smile. The perfect family lie was behind him. Now, it was time to build something real. Months after the divorce was finalized, Ethan found himself in a place he had never thought possible: content. His kids were thriving in the stability he provided, and while the wounds of Allison and Ryan's betrayal still lingered, they no longer consumed him. He'd even started dating again, cautiously, with a woman named Grace he had met through mutual friends. Grace was kind, patient, and understanding of his past, a refreshing contrast to everything he'd endured. But just as Ethan thought he was closing the chapter on his old life, fate delivered one last, devastating twist. It arrived one unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, tucked into his mailbox amidst bills and junk mail. Ethan almost didn't notice it at first, just a plain, nondescript envelope with no return address. But as he opened it, a sense of unease washed over him. Inside was a single piece of paper with 2 lines written in neat, block letters. The lies aren't over. Look deeper. DNA doesn't lie. Ethan stared at the note, his mind racing. DNA? What did that mean? He felt his chest tighten as the implications hit him like a freight train. For days, Ethan tried to ignore the note, telling himself it was probably some cruel prank. But the seed of doubt had already been planted, and it grew relentlessly. He thought of his 2 kids, Lily and Ben, who were the light of his life. They were his world, his reason for fighting through the darkest moments. But what if? The thought made him physically sick. He tried to push it away, to tell himself that it didn't matter. He loved them, no matter what. But the questions gnawed at him, refusing to be silenced. Finally, unable to take the uncertainty any longer, Ethan ordered an at-home DNA test. He felt like a traitor as he swabbed his children's mouths, but he told himself it was for peace of mind. The results came back 2 weeks later. Ethan opened the email with shaking hands, his heart pounding in his chest. Lily's results came first. 99.9% parent-child match. Relief flooded through Ethan, so overwhelming that he almost cried. But when he opened Ben's results, the world seemed to tilt beneath him. 0% parent-child match. Ethan stared at the screen, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. It felt like a mistake, like a cruel joke. But DNA didn't lie. That evening, Ethan waited for Allison to pick up the kids for her weekend visit. When she arrived, smiling as though everything were normal, Ethan felt his anger bubbling beneath the surface. "Allison," he said, stopping her before she could leave with the kids. "We need to talk. Now." She frowned, her expression wary. "What's this about?" Ethan handed her a copy of the DNA results, his jaw tight. "Explain this." Allison's face turned ashen as she read the results. For a moment, she looked like she might deny it, but then she sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "I was going to tell you," she whispered. I didn't know how." "You didn't know how?" Ethan's voice was cold, sharp. "How about, hey, Ethan, there's a chance Ben isn't yours." That would have been a good start. Tears streamed down Allison's face, but Ethan felt no sympathy. "Who is his father, Allison? Tell me the truth. No more lies." She hesitated, her lips trembling, and Ethan felt the rage boiling inside him. "If you don't tell me," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "I will find out myself. So choose carefully." Finally, Allison looked up, her face a mask of regret. "It's Ryan," she said, her voice barely audible. Ethan froze. For a moment, he thought he might actually black out. He had suspected the worst, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. "Ryan?" he repeated, his voice trembling with fury. "You mean the man who was supposed to be my best friend? The man who destroyed my marriage? He's Ben's father?" Allison nodded, her tears falling freely now. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Ethan. It started before I even knew I was pregnant. I thought Ben might be yours. But when he was born, I started to suspect." "Stop," Ethan snapped, cutting her off. He couldn't listen to her excuses, not now, not ever. Ethan stood there for a long moment, staring at the woman who had once been the center of his world. He thought of Ben, the boy he had raised, the boy who called him Dad, without hesitation. The boy who wasn't his. But then, Ethan made a choice. "Get out," he said quietly, his voice steady. "What?" Allison looked at him, confused. "You heard me," he said, his tone unyielding. "Get out of my house. Take your things, take your lies, and get out. I'll figure out how to tell Ben when the time is right, but you don't get to be a part of my life anymore." Allison tried to argue, to plead, but Ethan had already made up his mind. He called Grace, who came over to help him process what had just happened. Her calm presence grounded him, reminding him that he had a future outside of the pain Allison and Ryan had caused. In the months that followed, Ethan focused on moving forward. He sought therapy to help him navigate the complexities of his relationship with Ben, deciding that he would never let the boy feel unloved or unwanted. Ben was his son in every way that mattered, even if they didn't share the same DNA. As for Ryan and Allison, they were little more than ghosts from a life Ethan had left behind. He heard rumors that their relationship had fallen apart under the weight of their guilt and shame, but he didn't care. Ethan's life wasn't perfect, but it was real. And as he stood in his backyard one sunny afternoon, watching Lily and Ben chase each other across the grass, he realized he had something far better than the perfect family lie. He had the truth.